Our reading this morning comes from Father Greg Boyle. He is the charismatic Jesuit priest who is the director of Homeboy Industries, founded to counter the impact of gangs on his LA neighborhood, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world, and he created it. And he writes in his book, Barking to the Choir, The Power of Radical Kinship, Scripture reminds us constantly that we are meant not to wait for salvation, but to watch for it today. Heaven, then, is not a promise we await, but a practice we fully engage in. What is entirely available to us is the kingdom of God, or what the Buddhists call pure land. Outside a cemetery chapel, while we silently await a coffin to be placed in a hearse, I see a young girl of 3 or 4 across from me who's inquieta. In an attempt to reduce her fidgeting, her mom reaches into a large bag, takes out a beautiful ripe pear, and hands it to her daughter. The girl twirls the pear around, observing every part of it, first right side up, then upside down. She considers this pear in the morning sunshine, then asks her dad quietly, "How do you open it?" It's a good question. How do we open our hearts and minds to a new way of thinking? How do we open a path toward a transformed life? How can our eyes be opened? One need not have been there to imagine how the father answered his daughter's question. Take a big old bite. Yeah, look before you leap, but leap. Richard Rohr was right. We don't think ourselves into a new way of living. We live ourselves into a new way of thinking. Take a big old bite, even if you don't know exactly how to open it. Leap, and the net will appear. Change. So we sang the verse in our opening hymn that is the title of my sermon today. And if you're like me, you'll come to the conclusion, and I'll say this in Spanish first for Carlos, La vida es como la ropa interior. El cambio es bueno. Life is like underwear. Change is good. There is no doubt that we are in the midst of big change here in our congregation. Next week, we'll say farewell to one of our youth who is joining the Navy and heading off to basic training. One of our church families has experienced a bereavement this past week, and another in the past few weeks. The end of the school year is looming, and our children will be making transitions to different grades and schools. The end of the church year is not far off now. The nominating committee has been trying to put together a slate of elected leaders for the congregational meeting that is scheduled for June the 2nd. My leaving is drawing ever nearer, and the transition team is working hard on the process to find an interim minister who will come to Augusta. These changes and many more that we don't know about are causing stress and anxiety to bubble up in our lives. So my message this morning is, don't be afraid of some change. Change might make us afraid, might increase stress, might cause anxiety. Anxiety is insidious, and often we don't realize how it drives our moods, our reasoning, our blood pressure, our reactions to others. Jeffrey Gitomer says that change is not a 4-letter word, but often your reaction to it is. I'd like to ask our congregational family this morning to hold the church board in your hearts. The board met this week, and we have, as boards always do, serious issues to consider and competing interests to weigh. And members and even non-members of this church express their anxiety to the board in challenging ways sometimes, preaching to them or trying to teach them or persuade them with their presence or with email messages. They really do mean well. And I hope that they also remember that the board was brought in last June with a vote of confidence by the congregation. And if we can just hang on to the importance of trust and of assuming good intentions, that the board is really doing its best in decisions after consulting a wide variety of sources and getting advice from many different places, then that is what our polity asks of us. We can't all be involved in making decisions. That's not democracy, that's chaos. And so the trust that we place in our board members to do the right thing is vital. I would ask that you look at the board members here today and see that they're not scheming or ignorant or closed-minded. Of course not. We have a hard-working board, and its members are open to hearing legitimate concerns. They already themselves share many of those concerns, but they are doing their job. They are the ones who came forward this time last year, stepping up to serve this church. So a little frank talking this morning. We've had some difficult issues to deal with this year, to wrestle with, and many of them may turn out to have been resolved by good decisions. Some other decisions may turn out to be ones that were made hastily or without proper perspective, and that's life. We all have this range of competency in our own decision-making. But our covenant calls us to assume good intentions. And I feel that if anywhere, that's where we fall down in our dealings with each other. Remembering that we trust one another to have the best interests of this church at heart will keep us in good shape. We're celebrating our 65th anniversary at UUCA. So maybe it's not surprising that a congregation can show its age by occasionally being a little crotchety or grumpy, experiencing a few aches and pains. Maybe the vision of the future we can make for our young children, our future UUs, sometimes can get clouded by our nostalgia for what we used to do in the good old days. But even things that seemed to work at the time, like the suggestion that we could do without a minister for a while once Reverend Gaye leaves. We can save some money by just rounding up some folks to do pastoral care or leading a few worship services. That'll be fine. After all, we did it 20 years ago. Well, there are many things that we did 20 years ago that we would agree we wouldn't want to do today. What were you wearing 20 years ago for a start? Hairstyles, glasses. And I may joke about this, but let me be serious for just a moment and say that there is a lot to do in the next 2 years to get this congregation ready for another settled minister. Our board realizes this and decided that professional ministry needs to continue to support this church. And to be frank, our nominating committee isn't being overrun with folks stepping up for leadership for the elected positions that need to be filled next year. So in addition to those positions and the work that members are already doing, finding that magic group of ministerial surrogates is just a misguided fantasy. Not to mention that when a prospective minister looks at this congregation with an eye to settled ministry, and they see that lay leaders are trying to do the job of an interim in order to cut corners financially, they will think twice about wanting to come here. And I got that message straight from the UUA transitions officer, Keith Cron. Proposing the drastic step of doing without a minister is something that occasionally happens in congregations concerned with finances, according to our UUA congregational life staff member, Christine Purcell. People who think in terms of cutting staff have the ability, in my opinion, to only see solutions to perceived problems by subtracting from the church. They lack the creativity in seeing how adding to the church makes us better and stronger. I guess it's the half-empty, half-full problem of perception. Some people who advocate that idea haven't taken the broader view, haven't looked around at the experience of other churches that have gone without ministers. And I can give you an example in my own experience where our sister congregation, the Aiken UU Church, was at a real disadvantage when they were without a minister. This was right around the time when marriage equality became legal in South Carolina. Suddenly, UU congregations found themselves able to offer marriage to the LGBTQ community, where many other churches were refusing, even though it was legal. I got a call from the Aiken UU board president, who told me that they really needed a minister to perform the ceremonies. Even though there were a couple of members who could perform marriages, they were noticing that many people who were inquiring decided not to be married at the UU church in Aiken because a minister was not there to perform the wedding. So I was asked to cover for them. And there was another very important issue that developed during the time that Aiken was without a minister, and that was of evident professional leadership in the interfaith community. There was no minister to represent the church at meetings where other religious leaders gathered. And again, the president told me that the church was feeling left out of community initiatives because it lacked a leader who could participate in the building of interfaith community. Rightly or wrongly, it meant that the Aiken UU church lacked credibility because there was no minister. I don't normally emphasize all that I do as minister for this church, but maybe I do need to tell you that I've been very active in promoting our church in the wider interfaith, cultural, and civic community. And it has paid off. Gone are the days when UUCA was considered a cult at the extreme. But also there was a time when people from other faith communities would not even come to meetings at this church. Since we've hosted not only the Interfaith Fellowship, Progressive Religious Coalition, and Interfaith Coalition events, but also have supported the NAACP, Transgender Support Group, League of Women Voters, and Fort Gordon events, we have shown Augusta that we are a church that has an open door policy without a proselytizing agenda or an un-American attitude. There's a lot of outreach that goes on in my job, and just one example coming up in mid-April for about the 5th time in the past few years, I'll be the mayor's chaplain of the day, giving the invocation for the Augusta-Richmond County Commissioners meeting at the Municipal Center. Other area religious leaders are asked to do this task, of course, and getting on the list to do this was no small feat. I've been asked more times than I've been able to perform that role. Some of the people who are suggesting we turn inward to take care of our own without a minister have no sense of what being part of the association of congregations means for us. A minister can take advantage of connections and opportunities within the Unitarian Universalist Association. I gathered a church team together 2 years ago to write a grant proposal for outreach, and the UU funding program awarded a grant for us. And I did the same thing last year, and we got another grant for outreach to the Fort Gordon LGBTQ community, a community of folks who are feeling targeted, unvalued, and outcast because of this government's homophobic actions and pronouncements. It's important work, and I've been privileged to make it happen. I was remembering that as a kid, I always watched the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday evenings. And one regular entertainer was a man who could spin a dozen plates on tall poles at the same time. Remember that? Moving from one to the other to make sure none of them fell. And I was thinking that what a minister does is kind of like what a plate spinner does. I'm seeing all the work that is already being done by members and friends, and then all the possibilities for this congregation, and I'm supporting every one of them and trying not to let any of them wobble too much or fall. However, at this month's retreat for the ministers of the Southeastern region, we had a speaker who suggested a different image, that worship, at least, requires ministers to be curators. Just like at museums or art galleries, where curators select the exhibits, coordinate the exhibitions, and make decisions about which pieces of art get displayed because they know the context and history of every piece. A minister who leads worship chooses carefully what elements she thinks will resonate within the congregation and will need to remember what readings have been done recently, work with the music director to select hymns that haven't been sung too much, create a time for all ages that is relevant and meaningful for all ages, preach a message that will be worthwhile for those in the sanctuary, and create a safe space for them to have their needs fulfilled. The minister in the same vein is the one who makes sure that continuity isn't forgotten in the operations of the church, who connects people with others to get things done, who lifts up those things and people that may get left behind or forgotten. It takes skill, professional training, and a willingness to go elbow deep into detail and the messy stuff of relationship. Believe it or not, there are actually people who choose this line of work. When I became the developmental minister of this congregation in 2013, I attended the training of both developmental and interim ministers. And I can assure you with confidence that interim ministers are hardworking, dedicated, innovative thinkers and leaders whose mission is to help congregations get into tip-top shape for another settled minister. I have no doubt that this congregation will be really attractive to all the interim ministers who are looking this year. Now, as I'm also, like UUCA, getting to the 65th year of existence, I am looking forward to slowing down a little. And full-time ministry is not something that I'll be pursuing when I move to my new home. And I'm okay with that. As much as I have loved being here and doing all these things with you, I have, of course, had to adjust my thinking about what that change will mean for me. And I'm conscious of the need to adjust my attitude. Charles Swindoll says we cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play on the one string we have, and that is our attitude. Change is a necessary part of our lives, of our human development. And the stages we go through have been described in many ways. I don't know if you've seen Jane Fonda talking about the 5 acts of her life in a recent HBO documentary, and she says, in order to go forward, I have to know where I've been. And she began her 5th act in her 60s. So too do we have acts or chapters that define who we are and that lead us to the next stage. Richard Rohr has been writing this past week about human development in his daily blog. And he explains the way that scripture scholar Walter Brueggemann connects the development of the Hebrew scriptures with the development of human consciousness. It's very interesting, and I'll read it to you. Brueggemann says that there are 3 major parts of the Hebrew scriptures: the Torah, the prophets, and the wisdom literature. The Torah, or the first 5 books, corresponds to the first half of life. This is the period in which the people of Israel were given their identity through law, tradition, structure, group ritual, and chosenness. As individuals, we each must begin with some clear structure and predictability for normal, healthy development, a la Maria Montessori. That's what parents are giving their little ones: containment, security, safety, specialness. Ideally, you first learn you are beloved by being mirrored in the loving gaze of your parents and those around you. You realize that you are special and that life is good, and thus you feel safe. The second major section of the Hebrew Scriptures, the prophets, introduces the necessary suffering or stumbling stones and failures that initiate you into the second half of your life. Prophetic thinking is the capacity for healthy self-criticism, the ability to recognize your own dark side. Without failure, suffering, and shadowboxing, most people and most of religion never move beyond narcissism and clannish thinking. This has been most of human history up to now, Walter Brueggemann says, which is why war has been the norm. But healthy self-criticism helps you realize that you are not that good, and neither is your group. It begins to break down either-or dualistic thinking as you realize all things are both good and bad. This makes idolatry and the delusions that go with it impossible. Brueggemann says, my mother could give me prophetic criticism and discipline me, and it didn't hurt me indefinitely because she gave me all the loving and kissing and holding in advance. I knew the beloved status first of all. And because of that, I could take being criticized and told I wasn't the center of the world. The leaven of self-criticism added to the certainty of your own specialness will allow you to move into the third section of the Hebrew Scriptures, the wisdom literature, which comprises many of the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, and the book of Job. Here you discover the language of mystery and paradox. This is the second half of life. You are strong enough now to hold together contradictions in yourself and others with compassion, forgiveness, and patience. You realize that your chosenness is for the sake of letting others know they are also chosen. You have moved from the Torah's exclusivity and separation to inclusivity and allowing everything to belong. The knowledge that we build up over time, the years we live with ourselves, can lead us to this third and most fulfilling stage, holding together contradictions in yourself and others with compassion, forgiveness, and patience. A mature church has this quality about it, just like we hope to find in the wisdom of our elders. We need to let go of anxiety, of mistrust, even of our own self-assured certainties that result from privilege, male privilege, white privilege, class privilege, and instead choose patience and compassion. It is only in trusting the love that we feel in this church family and the values that will build up over time in our beloved community that we can live into this second half of life, which I hope will go on far longer than the next 65 years for UUCA. Even as we prayed in our opening prayer for stability and change, let's remember that change is the only constant we have in our lives. So life is like underwear. Change is good. But change, in order to thrive, has to be led by good intentions, by people who recognize the gifts they have and how they can best offer them to the wider community. I trust that our last few months together will see this ongoing development of goodwill, of loving kindness, and of vision for the future of this church family. Blessed be. Amen.